A good
Okay.
breeze, that's for sure.
Okay. I think we will start. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, and I serve as co-director of the Institute. As the Institute's name emphasizes, our overarching mission is to ensure that the development of the carbon removal sector is effectuated responsibly in a manner that helps protect the climate as well as the communities that host carbon removal projects. One of our closest partners in the carbon removal field, the NGO Carbon 180, focuses much of its work on these issues also. And it recently announced the launch of its community informed, open access, reviewed, and evaluated, or CORE, framework. And we're fortunate enough today to have two of the architects of the framework with us today to provide an overview of CORE and how it's contemplated to work at the outset and how it may evolve in the future. So I'd like to introduce our two guests today. First of all, Dr. Charlotte Levy, who serves as the senior research lead on the science and innovation team at Carbon 180, and Nasia Dodson, who is the equity and justice advisor on the equity and justice team at Carbon 180. Welcome to Scrubbing the Skies. Uh, as usual, our format will be an initial intervention by our guests of approximately 20 to 25 minutes in this case. I will then seek to seed our conversation after that with a couple of initial questions. One of the things that I encourage our audience to do is to populate today we're using the chat box instead of the Q&A box to populate the chat box with questions you have as they arise. This will help me determine how much time we need to accord at the end in terms of audience questions. And so after my initial questions, we'll move to audience questions and then conclude at the top of the hour. So with that, I will turn over the microphone to Charlotte.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having us. It's such a treat to get to talk with you. And this is an exciting time that we're at in carbon removal. It's no longer just a research conversation. We're talking about direct air capture facilities that, are sited next to specific towns, kelp projects that are a few miles off fishing communities' coasts, soil amendment programs that are directly working with working ranches. So carbon removal is showing up in real places with real neighbors and with decisions that are being made today that affect how the precedents that are going to be set for the next few decades. And for us, what that means is that we really want to shift from theory into practice when it comes to realizing climate impact and realizing environmental justice opportunities. As these efforts have become real, we've been able to build over 10 years of experience and an entire field's worth of effort to draw from as we think about how can we systematize and streamline these efforts. So that's why we're excited to introduce CORE. If you could show the next slide. CORE is our carbon removal framework, and it stands for Community Informed, Open Access, Reviewed, and Evaluated, as we said at the top. And this is our framework for what responsible carbon removal looks like as the field moves from research into deployment. It's how we establish shared expectations for how carbon removal should be designed, implemented, and evaluated, so decisions are more consistent, more transparent, and more accountable across the field. If you could click forward. Thanks so much. And if you click a few more times, there we go. We see CORE as a toolkit to close some of the gaps that we've seen in the field. Gaps between theory and clear implementation that make validating carbon removal so time-consuming and expensive for even the most dedicated purchasers. Gaps in language and values that can impede progress, even when we're able to bring communities, implementers, and policymakers to the same table. Even just gaps in language for basic terms like accountability or transparency that get used constantly without meaning the same thing from one room to the next. We know this disconnect creates friction and it creates risk when we're trying to scale up successfully. Next slide.
That's right, Char. And I think those gaps will feel really familiar to not only people across the field, but people in attendance today. I'm going to talk a bit about how we worked to close them. So, the core carbon removal framework was built from years of partnership. Carbon 180 has spent nearly a decade in conversation with communities, land and ocean stewards, farmers and ranchers, developers, purchasers, funders, and policymakers. And CORE pulls together what we've been able to learn from site visits with our community partners, workshops on adoption barriers for producers. We've had consultations with developers and potential purchasers, and we've held direct engagement with land and ocean stewards. And we can scoot to the next slide. That field level learning sits alongside research we've conducted that spans environmental justice, climate policy, carbon accounting, and governance. And it draws on lessons from existing community benefits frameworks and from historical failures in climate and infrastructure deployment. Carbon 180 has some unique learnings about the needs of communities and land and ocean stewards in this field. And our core carbon removal framework is one of the places where those learnings are translated into something that's of utility for people outside of our org. It's also important to name that we did not build core in a vacuum. Our framework went through an extensive external review with folks who are policy experts, researchers, purchasers, state agency staff, and our trusted community partners. That review process was able to surface real tensions, and we worked through them, and our core framework is stronger for it. And we can go to the next slide. The framework itself houses three main sections. The first is a statement that outlines the systemic challenges that we believe shape today's carbon removal field. What we call our issues statement names structural inequities, governance failures, environmental and human health risks, and weaknesses in climate accounting as the four major hurdles that the carbon removal field faces. The second section is our list of principles, which include terms like justice, equity, net negativity, and accountability. And we believe those underscore the work that needs to be done to resolve those four major systemic challenges. The core framework offers concise and accessible definitions for each principle, and you can find those online in our core framework glossary or inside the report itself. And finally, CORE's third section is dedicated to our practices. Our practices operationalize and translate our principles into the actions that shape facets of an intervention, like its community engagement, its design, its governance, monitoring, and verification. And together, our core principles and practices offer a structure for evaluating from any perspective whether a carbon removal intervention has been designed to deliver meaningful outcomes. And we can go to the next slide. Included with each of the practices, which, as you saw on the last slide, included things like knowledge building and environmental health and independent verification, are key questions, definitions, a section on what needs to be true for that practice to be meaningfully incorporated into a carbon removal intervention. And we also provide example case studies. This format was intentional, and it allows for that multi-perspective evaluation to feel easy and approachable regardless of your familiarity with carbon removal. Each core framework practice is designed to offer shared language, expectations, and examples of what a particular practice looks like in the real world and not just on paper. And we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a pretty hefty piece of work. And so to support that, we decided to build more than just a white paper for this launch. If you go to our website, the core landing page, you'll see that we've designed this as a working toolkit, not just the place where you download and read the framework. If you could click forward, when you land on the page, one of the first things you'll see is our core wheel, which gives you the common language definitions of these principles, and then expands them into practices. Each practice is paired with an exemplar case study, so you can click through and see how it was shown up in the real world. If you could click again, so we can see that. Yep, so here's our case studies. We deliberately drew many of these case studies from contexts outside carbon removal, where there's been time to build trust and evaluate long-term outcomes. There's an example if you click again. Thank you. So we really wanted to focus on how carbon removal does not need to reinvent every wheel. We can have these kinds of community engagements, have touch points that have where we've got real world experience and where the field can learn from work that has already been done. Next slide. We also built a page around audience framing, so you can navigate to resources based on who you are and what you're looking for. Whether you're someone who's encountering carbon removal, someone who's supporting carbon removal, or someone who's doing carbon removal. And we intentionally designed these entry points to cut across some of the typical industry silos. So those doing carbon removal, for instance, includes both project developers and landowners and stewards who are exploring practices with carbon removal potential. Those supporting carbon removal includes both purchasers on the voluntary market, but also agencies running public funding programs. Next slide. For people who want to see the framework in action, we also put together a set of hypothetical scenarios that you can click through from that toolkit page. There's one for a direct air capture facility, for programmatic agriculture, and for an ocean alkalinity enhancement project. If you click through, you'll see that each scenario walks through the full life cycle of an intervention, from site selection to shutdown, and pauses at key decision points where you can surface those practices and approaches that CORE is recommending. If you click through a few times, when community benefits agreements comes up, for instance, we link out to guidance on what that might look like, templates that you could use for creating a community benefits agreement, and then an example of a completed community benefits agreement. Okay. Behind all of that sits our resource hub, which is the searchable repository of those tools, templates, and case studies. You can filter by audience, by resource type, and by implementation scale, depending on whether you're working at the project level or the program level. This landing page helps to take CORE from just a document that you read once into something that you can use repeatedly and that we can build together as a community, making sure that best practices aren't hard to come by and hard to find.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's these accessible entry points that also help emphasize that the core framework can work across both pathways and theories of change. So we recognize as an org, Carbon 180, and in our core carbon removal framework, that CDR doesn't happen in just one form. We recognize that some interventions are projects, and we're thinking of those as site-specific endeavors with a defined boundary, a specific set of neighbors, and a clear life cycle. So a direct air capture facility would be an example of a project. It could also be a specific kelp deployment or an individual biochar operation on a farm. Other carbon removal interventions operate at what we call a programmatic scale. So, a state ag incentive program that supports practices where carbon removal is a co-benefit would be considered a program. Federal procurement is also a program, and a jurisdictional standard for what qualifies as eligible carbon removal is also a program. Both projects and programs shape outcomes, and both projects and programs are covered within the scope of CORE, but their leverage points are different. So for projects, our core framework shows up in places like siting decisions, governance design, community benefits, monitoring, and long-term stewardship. And for programs, core shows up in places like determining eligibility criteria, setting procurement standards, oversight structures, and deciding how the program learns over time. The core framework was deliberately written to speak to both. And state programs that adopt core aligned criteria can shape hundreds of projects downstream, which is a part of why state level adoption matters so much for the carbon removal field.
Um, Another thing that's really important to the way we built core is that we're offering guidance, but not a pass or fail checklist or a competing compliance regime. We recognize that this is an evolving field and that a fixed checklist would miss some of the realities of different places, approaches, and stages of development. Instead, what we're doing is we're setting a shared baseline so that expectations are clear even as implementation varies, and where the goal is not perfection, but greater access to the ability to make better decisions, to make them earlier, to make them with more clarity and more accountability built in from the start. Um, and for any policymakers in our audience, one more clarification. This is not federal or state policy. It's a tool that informs how that policy is going to be developed. So I hope you'll also pay close attention to our team as we release pathway-specific roadmaps over the next several months. These are going to be a guide to what we see as the next steps for policy in tech, tech CDR, in ocean marine CDR, and in agricultural CDR.
Yeah. I'm going to use this slide to talk about how the core work is going to support Carbon 180's equity and justice work coming up very soon. But right off the bat, it's important to name that the core framework is not a substitute for relationship building. The core framework is not a substitute for trust building or cultivating long-term partnerships. All of those are work that is required by real equity and justice centered carbon dioxide removal, and none of that gets shortcut by a framework. What our core framework does is give communities and community-based organizations a shared piece of language to bring to the table when they are engaging with folks like developers, purchasers, and state agencies. Our core framework names rights, it names expectations, and it lists relevant questions in terms that are accessible across audiences. Our equity and justice team at Carbon 180 plans to use the core framework to support our community-based partners and our regranting partners as they evaluate carbon removal proposals in their regions. We expect the framework in those conversations to be a starting point and not an end point. As an equity and justice team, it's our intention to keep listening to what is and is not working and to maintain a continued commitment to being honest about where the framework needs to grow to better serve our community partners' priorities. We're also planning to use CORE to inform how communities and community-based orgs can prepare for outreach and engagement. So our team recognizes and has been informed over and over again that grassroots level advocacy is oftentimes working against real capacity constraints, most often time and funding. So to help communities and community-based orgs meet the moment, we're planning to offer one-pagers with questions for first-time meetings with project developers, as well as prep sheets that include relevant technical knowledge by CDR pathway. We're coupling that work with a series of narrative interviews, very exciting, to lift the work of our community partners who've been advocating for core-aligned carbon removal in their communities. And also just something I'm popping in as well before we transition slides is that our equity and justice team is planning on coalition building in the very near future. We're excited about being able to host workshops, convenings, and to hopefully have in-person events as well. So if anyone on the call is themselves or knows of someone who is an interested community member or an interested community-based org, I'm very happy and my team is very happy to connect, and we very much look forward to working with you or folks that you know. And we can change the slide.
Yeah. And everything you were just saying, everything I'm going to introduce really is one of the most exciting things about this having not been built in a vacuum, but rather built through our ongoing engagements and relationships. So we're already seeing ways that we can put core into use to advance stronger carbon removal policy. For instance, in Colorado, we're working with the State Health and Environment Department to support developing quality standards that span the full range of carbon removal approaches, using core as the scaffolding for what those standards need to cover and how they should hold both technical and community considerations in one piece. We're also combining this with collaboration in the same state with the Yale Carbon Containment Lab to support co-developing and validating public outreach materials that can have stronger impact for informing about opportunities in biomass burial. We're working in several other states as well. So we'll be socializing core with states with Massachusetts, Alaska, and California, where there's already a lot of state motivated interest in expanding carbon removal opportunities. If you have a carbon removal undertaking that could benefit from core, please reach out. And in all of our partnerships, as I've said before, core is not policy in itself. It's a shared baseline that we can use to evaluate that policy and to make it easier for state programs, agency staff, and community partners to align without needing to deeply invest in all new research in order to figure out what carbon removal should look like in their state.
Nice. And I'll close by flagging something that's super important to us on the core team. Core is a living document. We understand that carbon removal is moving fast, science is advancing, new governance structures are coming into play. Communities and stewards are either just now beginning or continuing to shape how decisions get made. Markets and public funding are expanding, and a static framework would fail to keep pace. So we at Carbon 180 build core with an explicit commitment to evolve it. We fully expect updates as our community partners and implementers surface new challenges, as new evidence emerges, monitoring and verification systems improve, policy frameworks shift, and implementation experience in the real world reveals gaps that we couldn't have anticipated in a V1. That means we need you. We are actively inviting feedback from everyone, communities, land and ocean stewards, purchasers, policymakers, researchers, developers, funders, and anybody else who's interacting with CORE. Your feedback can look like suggesting clarifications, identifying implementation barriers for you or your team or your organization, if you want to raise concerns or propose new principles and practices, or even share case studies from your own work. We have a feedback form on our core landing page, and we review submissions on a rolling basis. We have substantive revisions planned, and they'll be documented in our V2, so stay tuned for that. What we are asking from you all today is for your engagement. Please use the framework, test it, push back on it, tell us where it lands, where it falls short, and where it needs to grow. That's how this core framework becomes a real shared baseline for the field instead of another report that's published and sits on a shelf. In the end, carbon removal will not be judged by whether it works in theory, but by whether we can implement it responsibly in the real world. And CORE is one of those tools we hope helps the carbon removal field meet that bar. So, in that spirit, we're very excited to welcome questions from you, Will, and from folks in today's audience. Thank you guys so much for your time and attention. That's it from us.
Great, great. Thank you so much for that initial intervention, Charlotte and Nasia. And so, yeah, let me just ask you a few questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. I guess a couple of process questions at the outset. What what did this journey look like? How did you structure your initial interactions with others, and who were some of those others, and how did they influence ultimately what you developed?
Mm, where should we start, Shar? Should I take a stab or would you like to
Oh,
go
I'd,
first?
I'd love to have you kick it off because, yeah, there's a wealth there.
Yeah, happy to. You've asked a very deep question at the outset, Will. This core framework has internally had many lives. It began as the equity and justice team at Carbon 180, trying to operationalize terms like equity, justice, accountability, transparency that we often talk about in carbon removal, but people who we consider to be the doers, as Charlotte named, found difficulty in having clear guidance on what that means. So, what is equity in carbon removal? How do I do just carbon removal. So it began as internal guidance for our org, over time and with the growth and development of our science and innovation team, which Charlotte is a part of, we saw a need to couple our messaging, that justice and equity and high accountability were all vehicles whose messaging applied to the same audiences. We saw a need to make sure that justice and equity showed up in the same places where high accountability was discussed and vice versa, which is how our teams came to collaborate. And I'll speak on the equity and justice team side for externalizing. We leaned on our community partners very early on for actual content mapping. So, making sure that our principles reflected the work that they were doing and the work that they saw needing to be done in the carbon removal field, which is where we get equity, transparency on down. And for our practices, asking people, how we can meet the moment, instead of trying to make carbon removal the driver for people, how to retrofit carbon removal to work that's happening on the ground. We got a ton of guidance from community-based partners, which is where we got workforce development from, community benefits, community agency. So a lot of scoping to try to see how carbon removal can complement community work that's existing. And I can pass the rest of the question to Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you. Another thing that we did was to really want to think about the tactical applications of what we were putting together to make sure this was something that really was in a format answering questions that the community really needed and providing support the community really needed. So we also did a lot of interviews with major carbon removal purchasers, with major carbon removal supporters, to really understand like what were some of the struggles in the field. And so that's one of the reasons why we put together this evolving resource hub, was because we were recognizing that even when people had some clarity about like, okay, I need to put together a community benefits agreement, I'm behind it, I want to create it. It was a lot of work and a lot of people time to figure out what that should actually look like, even though there are great examples that the field has put together to try and create that.
I'm curious in that context. I think I agree. Community benefit agreements is a daunting task, right? For a community to think about, for project developers to think about, and it's my understanding that you have examples, right? And I was just curious, how extensive is that database of community benefit agreements? And they're not restricted, I would have presumed, to carbon removal, but what does that look like currently?
Yeah, so not restricted to carbon removal, really trying to have each resource address a particular question, so again, like provide like a template of what a community benefits agreement could look like. And right now, we've really tried to focus on having a good example for everything we wanted to cover rather than having every good example that's out there. But as you said, this is sort of an evolving tool. We really want people to try this and to tell us, like, I really needed an answer to this question and I didn't have that resource, or it would have helped me to be able to compare and contrast. But as much as possible, we're trying to streamline, because of course you can do a search for many different examples of community benefits agreements. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's really helpful is to have just one example to go off of.
Another question I had was, what what kind of feedback did you get from the carbon removal sector itself, right? Because we can all be honest here, right? There are times that I think CDR startup companies, undercapitalized, facing a million other challenges in terms of getting these projects off the ground, sometimes view community engagement, and maybe more specifically community engagement with EJ communities, as a bit frightening, right? Uh, and I was just curious what kind of feedback you received from them in terms of development of these kind of, of guidelines for projects.
Maybe I'll start this one, Missy, and then I'd love to pass to you as well. Um, yeah, no, I think that we hear a lot of fear around some of this type of engagement.
Hmm.
Fear that you might invest a certain amount of time and effort and that you still don't end up with a project moving forward. Fear that you might try and do things wrong and that that might be worse than not having tried. And I think one of the things that we've really done here is we've had sort of general advice to the field about how to avoid some of those things, to engage early, to engage authentically, to build relationships ahead of when there's like a specific project deadline that needs to get stamped and certified. But we've also here sort of recognized like how does that actually fit into some of these different projects and timelines? So helping people recognize, okay, like if I say I want to engage early, like that might look like a stakeholder analysis, and that might look like that stakeholder analysis working towards building a a supportive group that's interested in learning more, and this is how you would do that. This is how you might build out, the group that could sign a community benefits agreement so that you don't sign an agreement and then have people still protesting about it. Um, and I think that kind of going back and forth between like the high level thinking and the practical is really what we've tried to do here.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Charlotte. On the aspect of the first step feeling unclear and fearful. I think some feedback we got was, okay, this is great. And what is step one? So we've tried to accommodate for those curiosities and that uncertainty as well, in our framework, in those examples that Charlotte walked through of like, this is step one for direct air capture. This is what step one could look like for OAE. We've tried to like mitigate some of those fears. Something that we name explicitly in the framework is the field's greatest risk is the loss of public trust. And so it is
Hmm.
a burden for startups who are financially constrained as well to go in, anticipating resistance or having to spend additional money because of the loss of time and pushbacks. But something that's very real, that we hold is that connecting with people is a technical skill in the same way every other part of carbon removal is. And if you don't have that skill, connect with somebody who does. And if you can't connect with somebody, we're very excited to meet you and work with you. But building public trust, long-term relationships, is just a huge part of reaching anything close to a gigaton scale carbon removal industry, and that the fear is warranted. A lot of people are approaching communities in like heavily industrialized, marginalized areas where distrust is how you receive, any type of, we'd like to come here and build infrastructure in your community. So how do you assuage that and work around that? And it is like Charlotte mentioned, coming in earnestly, early and often, trying to meet capacity constraints. So not hosting town halls 45 minutes away from a city center where people can't reach it by bus. Feeding people when you convene them, consider paying people for the time and expertise they lend you in a town hall, childcare, scheduling outside of 9 to 5 hours. There are many first steps that you can take that show that you're coming in earnestly, with an intent to engage and facilitate bi-directional learning for sure.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So uh, I'm going to move to some audience questions now. Um, First one is who decides what is the definition of core? I guess maybe the question is the scope. I'm loath to interpret somebody's question, but who decides what the definition of core is?
I could take a short stab at that, Charlotte, and then pass it back. If I'm understanding correctly, we tried not to unilaterally define or decide anything with this framework. It truly was iteratively built with as many external partners as we could source feedback from. What you see in this version one of the framework are definitions that are very much co-created And we hope with the extension of our feedback link and asking people to lean in and tell us where our sightlines fell short, that we can refine, improve, and expand those definitions in the future. So today, Carbon 180 and our external partners have defined core. In the future, we hope that it's something that the field takes shared ownership from and is made better by folks like you contributing your definitions to what core and our principles and practices are. And I'll also pass it to Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, great answer. I guess the other thing I would say is that, if we're thinking about this also like tactically, like who's deciding what core is and whether or not something's core. One thing we didn't want this to be was to be a sort of like another competing standard where someone has already purchased carbon removal, done the best work that they can, and then, we're shaking our fist at it saying like, well, it's not up to the core standard. Um, this is really like it's a toolkit. And if you go through all the steps of the toolkit and you're able to do every part of it, then I think you're going to find that you have a really high achieving, well-respected, beloved carbon removal project. And of course, if you're not yet, like if there's gaps in what's already been created, then I think this will give you a really good idea of where you could start to improve, to help to solve issues that you're encountering, to try to avoid having there be an erosion of trust. So in that sense, it's something that is applied by the people who are making use of it, who are developing, supporting, or learning about carbon removal.
All right. So this next question is kind of related to that. It said, how would you foresee partners best utilizing the core framework in situations where active CDR projects are already underway and working to combat misinformation within those communities where the projects reside?
I can jump in. I think that's a fabulous question. We have tried to account for a bit of that in the case studies that Charlotte mentioned by pathway, where you can kind of jump in at a different point in a carbon removal intervention's life cycle. How I would foresee partners utilizing it where projects are already active. I don't think any part of our framework requires you to be at a particular point in an intervention's life cycle. I think you can embed things like accountability and transparency presently, retroactively, and forward thinking. In terms of combating misinformation within the communities, that makes me think maybe of like conflating carbon dioxide removal with something like carbon capture and storage, or maybe not communicating risks or communicating risks that aren't actually attached to a project. Please let me know if I'm misunderstanding your question. But I do think that that process of convening people and engaging people on the ground and not just disseminating information through fact sheets or letting people leave public comments where the division between you and somebody else is a website and you might never meet that person face to face. I do think that it is in-person interaction that combats misinformation. It's also partnering with trusted people who are on the ground, people who have huge social license for a good reason, and partnering with those people to share information in the ways and languages that are most relevant to the people who'd be impacted on the ground. But that would be my answer if I'm understanding your question correctly. What about you, Shar?
I think it's a great question. I think the other thing that I would say about the misinformation piece in particular is that it's really good to ask yourself the question, like, not just is there misinformation, but why is this information being believed? Because it's very difficult to combat misinformation with new information. It can be very helpful to understand like what is the emotional resonance that is making somebody go with this source over any other source that they have access to. And that is where these authentic relationships within the community can be very impactful in overcoming, what may be like a knee-jerk reaction or what may be a response to real past harms that have been experienced. And they're not exactly aligned with what's happening now, but they feel aligned. And you have to recognize and respect that.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, next question. Have you considered the application of this framework outside of the United States? And does the framework cover issues of equity in terms of where a science or technical team is from in relation to the country or region of implementation? Is there an
Right
international
here.
to
Okay, what's
this?
up?
Uh, yeah, please
Such
turn off
such
your
a
microphones. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Pass that to you, Nasia. We talked so much about this.
Yeah, we definitely considered the scope of the framework quite a bit. And we ended up landing on one whose implications currently are very domestic. So there isn't an intentional international framing with this first version, but we have considered it. The framework does not cover issues of equity in terms of where a team is from. I think we do get at incorporating different types of knowledge and different lived experiences, which is maybe tangentially related to that difference in point of origin. We talk a lot about centering traditional ecological knowledge. We talk a lot about centering the lived regional experiences of people wherever a project or program is taking place. So I think in part we touch on stones that would lead you to that distinction between where a team is from and where there's working, but explicitly we don't name implications for international or foreign-based teams. No.
Mhm. And I
All
think
right. Oh, go ahead, sure.
I was just going to add to that. Core also is touching on some of the terms that I think are really familiar from just determining whether or not carbon removal has a real world impact, thinking about additionality, net negativity. And in those contexts, we really did lean very hard on what is already existing in the ecosystem. I mean, in all cases, we're trying to build forward and not build new. But in
Mhm.
particular for those areas, I think that what we've put together would be very familiar, should be recognizable to someone from any country that's trying to think about carbon removal. So that in that piece, it's very universal.
Okay. Next question, and this was one that I was curious about too. Is community veto power part of the core framework? Do you encourage a model, I guess, that defines social license to operate as going beyond just getting the requisite permits for a project from government entities, but requiring genuine community support, and how would you define genuine community support and so forth? Or is that part of the guidance that you provide?
It very much is. Thank you for asking. We actually have a section dedicated to community agency, and a very
Hmm.
large part of that discusses building governance structures over a project or a program with community. And our recommendation is embedding veto power into those governance structures. We're aware that that's a touchy subject for a lot of people, and so
Yep.
we understand the reservations that exist around fundraising capital for a project, and pulling together permits and then joining forces with community who have no financial vested interest in this project happening. We also do account for that, though we talk about community ownership models a bit.
Hmm.
But we understand that veto power is a touchy subject, but we do advocate for that, yeah, in the community agency section of our core framework.
Yeah, and I don't want to go too far off on this, but we find this a fascinating topic at the Institute, right? Also, how do you define community sentiment, right? Because
Mhm.
on any given project, right, by definition, there'll always be some opposition, almost invariably, right? But we're not going to say if there's a small group of people, perhaps that oppose a project, that's a community veto, right? And it's hard obviously to establish some kind of quantitative metric. So how do you tease out that idea of community acceptance of a project?
I can start, Shar, and
Sure.
pass it back. This is actually guidance that I've learned recently. So, not a Carbon 180 original idea, but something that we share very freely. A community partner that we work with, their method of assessing community buy-in is whenever they're convening people. They have a map of an area. They bring folks in, they convene people by colored name tag. So you hand somebody a colored name tag based on where they're, driving in from, riding in from, and you document that on a map. And once you feel like you have like a sufficient once you feel like your map is enough filled in, that you've talked to enough people from multiple places, that you have a rapport and relationships with people all across a map. Once you're holding meetings where everybody doesn't have the same colored name tag in, and obviously there's like, is that 3 months? Is that 5 months, 8 months, a year? I think that's a variable, but I think the spirit of that exercise is trying to make sure that you hit every corner of a community and not to achieve buy-in from every person, but that you've spoken, shown face, familiarized yourself, tried to combat misinformation. But that's an exercise that I've seen in practice that I've also heard very good things about, but is convening people, identifying themselves based on where they're from, and letting people identify themselves on a map and trying to fill that map in as best you can. The time frame, I think that depends on how ready a community is to convene. I think some communities, as we can name, have people who are boots on the ground, and you can find three names very easily, three organizations very easily who are connectors. And then other places, capacity is lower. And so the work is going to take longer and it's going to be more difficult to make sure that you can get across that map. But um, that is an exercise that I've heard of that I'm a fan of for sure. What about you?
Anything to add, Shar?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think one of the things we really highlight as in our templates and our guidance is that initial stakeholder analysis does allow you to try and segment who you're talking to and to segment by, whether it's a geographic sensitivity or a cultural sensitivity or even just an access sensitivity, like we were saying, like, that maybe this community has a number of very concerned parents who are not going to be able to attend a meeting in the middle of the day.
Hmm.
So all of those pieces coming together can help you understand whether or not you have a few outliers or you have an underrepresented group. There's a big difference between those.
Okay, great. Next question. What's your views on gold standard, for instance, where community benefit is also a core component? And what are your thoughts on the recent EU CRCF methods?
Mm. I can jump in on this one. So gold standard, amongst others, we spoke to a number of different groups and verifiers, and as part of putting this together to really understand what our framework could achieve, how it could support the field as it currently exists. So, we've talked to them about how they put together those community benefits pieces, and Gold Standard does. I guess one thing I would say is that Gold Standard represents some targeted pathways right now. They're not able to represent all of CDR in the approaches that they validate. One thing we've tried to do is to be very pathway agnostic with these approaches so that we're working from these principles to the practices that you can implement, but they're not tied to, like, if you're doing marine CDR, one must do this. And, if that marine CDR furthers like ocean alkalinity versus dock, then it has to be even more specific. We've tried to keep them overarching because, again, we're not trying to compete with the standards that are already existent in the field. We're trying to give people the tools to assess how those standards are working.
Anything to add with that, Nessia? I was just one thing I was curious about when you were talking about pathway agnostic. Are you pathway agnostic to the point where there is no specific sort of CDR approach that you would just say to a community, you should not consider this?
Mhm. Yes, I mean, I think as an organization and in this document we've published, we're not in the position, we're not trying to pick winners and losers. We're not trying to
Mhm.
tell communities what they should or should not consider.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly that doesn't mean that we consider them all perfectly equal. We would try
Right.
and provide advice on what is a good fit and what isn't. And that's showing up in the way that we are working to continue to socialize this. We're not just publishing and walking away. We are finding specific partners where we can help to implement core and walk through how core can be used to evaluate what the opportunities are in their community. But no, we're not, checking it against core and then saying like, well, absolutely no, this in
Mhm.
this community.
Okay, great. All right. Next question. Have you worked directly with lawmakers at any level of government, offering the core framework as a toolkit to help them develop policy? What sort of feedback have you received from staffers working for CDR champions?
Mhm.
And I saw you had a number of states listed, so this might be a good platform to show how this is working in the real world.
That's right. Yeah. And thank you for this question. I was excited to see this one come up. I will clarify and say that for the most part, we are working with agencies rather than lawmakers on this particular topic area. Though you're going to see how it is relevant to our conversations with lawmakers and policymakers in those roadmaps that will be coming out in the next few months. But for core specifically, we've talked to a lot of agencies who've really echoed what we've heard from other folks in the field, that it is hard to figure out how to stand up a carbon removal program of any kind from scratch. And that, there's many competing standards, many competing expectations. And it's very hard to understand like how you can fulfill that when you have limited capacity and limited people. So generally, we've gotten a really positive response to the toolkit approach, to especially our willingness to work with them on making sure that that toolkit is landing well and is being implemented in a way that is supportive. Um, and other feedback that we've heard is that implementability needs to keep coming, that there's a need for support in order to make sure these projects and programs are doing what they're supposed to.
Anything else in that, Nasia?
No, I think that's perfect.
Mhm. And please do watch for those roadmaps because they are coming out soon and they're going to be really terrific. You'll be seeing our tech policy roadmap first, then our marine CDR one. And then this fall, you'll be seeing two new pieces from our land policy team, one very focused on agriculture, and then the other one will be focused on forestry.
Great. Okay, let's see. This one is I volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, including as a co-lead of the Greenhouse Gas Removal Action Team. Of and Oh, I think that was just a comment. It's just somebody that is looking forward to working with this. Um, That's one thing I was curious about is one of the things that you said at the outset, which really resonated with me was, trying to ensure that this just doesn't end up being another report that sits on the shelf. What kind of outreach efforts are you using, and what do you contemplate doing in the future, and how can people that are on this in this webinar help to facilitate that kind of outreach?
Please interact with it. Please leave us feedback on our website. Like we mentioned, we review it iteratively, and the feedback that you guys leave us will be in a version two. I invite you the same way Carl has to connect with us. Um, Many of our teams this year are in a socialization mindset with the work products coming out that Charlotte's mentioned.
Mhm.
Charlotte's named working on states in particular. Our equity and justice team is partnering with communities to dig into already how to improve this. Um, we're kind of we're tunneling from every possible angle that we can to make this like a shared, collaborative, collectivized resource, something that people see as referential. So we have a glossary. Please come back and visit the glossary for clarification of terms. We have a user experience. Please come back and revisit for resources. We'll be updating those iteratively. Our intention is for this to be something that people use to do work and not just something that people read out of interest because of their work. So we are trying to make it as interactive, up to date, relevant, and readily available as possible. And part of that will include socializing it, hosting workshops iteratively to make this better when we re-release next.
Great, that's helpful. I guess one last question I had in terms of logistics for some of this, or Carbon 180's role in this, is obviously you're producing a lot of information that can be helpful for them. Uh, do you anticipate that you're going to do a lot of actual boots on the ground work with communities on these sort of things, or is it more of information provision? Because obviously you have limited amount of logistical resources yourself. But what does that look like if a community wants Carbon 180 to be involved in an actual process of negotiation with a project developer, for example? Do you have a role in that you envision?
Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly, we can't be involved with every project in the whole country, but our intention is to start by finding partners that are excited and interested in engaging, that have specific use cases. We're especially targeting a few specific states where we've seen a strong legislative mandate that doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily have the technical support, or where we've seen a lot of community interest that maybe doesn't have like that legislative mandate yet. And so that is going to help us keep filling out this resource hub and making our materials more generalizable, more usable. We expect that to also tie into work really helping to connect from project to project and program to program so that we can reach a point where it's not, yes, we'll help you stand up this whole new undertaking, but yes, we will refer you to the resources we've put together for similar groups like yours, and you can talk to those people and you can engage with some of those successes.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point is that connective tissue, right? Because now there have been enough projects, right, that there are best practices, lessons learned, things of that nature that are out there now, but a lot of times communities are adrift and not knowing, you know, even where to start in terms of finding those people, right? But that's
Mhm.
that's some of the most credible information too, right? Is from other communities, right, that have been working on these things. And so I think that's a really valuable part of this. So I think that's great. So, all right, we have reached the top of the clock, and I would like to once again thank Charlotte and Nasia for joining us today, talking about what I think is going to be a really valuable project for the CDR community as a whole, right? It's a critical aspect of making these things happen, in addition to the obviously daunting financial and technical questions in our field, right? But it's really important. So I'm glad you're doing it. And thanks to our audience once again for your thoughtful questions and for participating. We'll be back next month, and we'll announce in our usual channels. And until then, we say goodbye.